Welcome back to the Home Bar Beginner with me, Vic Vinegar, and today we're going to be talking about how liquor is made, or more specifically how spirits are made. So I think I said it probably like 10 times in my spirits video that I was going to be doing this follow-up video. So this is that. I'm also accompanied by the hypnotic daiquiri I made in a previous video. So this is just going to slowly disappear while I'm working, and maybe I'll get a little funnier as it goes. We'll see. This might and probably will also be part 1 of 2 of me filming it. So if like the lighting in my shirt change in the middle of it, don't worry about it. I'm going to stay on topic. So let's talk about how this stuff's actually made. So we're going to be talking about a couple of major categories or steps in the process of making spirits or making hard liquor, however you like to refer to that. Now, today will also kind of apply to liqueurs as well. I am talking most specifically about spirits, but some of the things I'll mention will also very heavily apply to different liqueurs and even some fermented alcohols like wine and beer and all of that. I said in my spirits video that this isn't going to be comprehensive in the sense that you're not going to be an expert leaving this. It will try and cover as many things as possible, and it's based off my knowledge, which isn't as an expert, and it's not even as a professional. I am a home bar beginner, really, still. I haven't been doing this that long, but I am doing stuff at a home bar just like you are. So I am really none the more qualified. I'm just passionate. Those categories I was talking about, though, we're going to talk about ingredients, so what actually goes into the still. Then we're going to talk about the formal distilling process that has to happen for a spirit to be a spirit. It must be a distilled product. We're also going to talk about aging and flavoring. We're going to talk about blending. We're also going to talk about bottling. So we're going to try and cover a wide kind of, from not quite when the seed's planted in the ground, but from crop to supermarket, really what steps go into making the spirits that you love or hate, depending on who you are. So first and foremost, to kind of not necessarily correct, but change a bit of what I said in the spirits video, I mentioned that only some things, or that some spirits specifically come from fermented alcohols as a base. So technically speaking, when I'm saying that something is distillable, it has to have alcohol present already. You can't just distill, you can't just throw plastic in there, expect it to distill and end up with alcohol vapors. That's not how it works. Something has to start to decompose or break apart the molecules, and then it turns into alcohol. So that's what I'm kind of correcting. Really, everything that is distilled has to be fermented for at least some portion first. What that does is it allows yeast to attack the sugars in whatever the distillate or mash is. I'm going to talk about mash in just a sec. That allows the sugars to break apart. Yeast goes after it. That yields some of the sugars, but also byproduct is alcohol. Then by distilling it, you're able to concentrate that. So one of those, like I mentioned, that brandy is distilled from wine. I really want to point that out because it is distilled from something that you would know is another product as wine. The reason I did not say that whiskey is distilled from beer is because it's not. Whereas brandy and pisco are distilled from things that you would recognize as something like a wine. Like I said, it might not be a wine you'd actually drink. Whiskey's not distilled from beer. Vodka's not distilled from potato beer, whatever you want to call that. They're not things that you drink in a different circumstance, and they're also not always fermented all that long. Sometimes it's a very quick fermentation process, whereas something like wine could sit for weeks, for months, going through this fermentation process or the aging process, blah, 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 blah. Wine's a whole other thing. So with that out of the way, and that kind of in your head and in mine, I want to talk about the first ingredient, which is yeast. And I'm not going to talk about it very long because I already basically just said what it does. It attacks the sugars in the distillate or the mash, and as a byproduct, alcohol is produced. So without yeast, you're getting nothing. It's not going to distill. Now, yeast is introduced in different ways. Some things have yeast that naturally occur on the distillate or the mash. Other times, yeast has to be poured in as like grains. and that is how they kick off the fermentation process. Okay, so that's yeast. It's incredibly important to the process of really all alcohol, but I'm gonna leave it at that because you can pretty much just Google what yeast is if you wanna see what the little microbe looks like, and that's about that. So we're gonna hop into the ingredients, or what I keep calling the distillate or mash. So distillate really isn't necessarily the appropriate word. Typically you would go with mash. So even more specifically, you talk about the mash bill. And it's kind of what it sounds like. It's basically just like ground up ingredients. So when we talk about like whiskey, or when I talked about whiskey before, I said that like bourbon has to have a mash bill of 51% corn. That meaning 51% of the material that is put in the still to be distilled has to be corn based. It has to be corn, period. So some things, the mash has to be all one specific grain or one specific ingredient. Some things it's just a given that it's one ingredient, and others you could have different grains, different ingredients, this and that. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go. I'm also going to start hopping into formal ingredients. I'm going to try and keep it alphabetical as I can. I'm definitely going to miss some. So if you know of a couple others that you'd like to comment, go for it. There's also some things that are distilled that are more pertaining to liqueurs, which I'm not specifically talking about today. Granted, the very first thing on our list is almonds. So almonds might be really obscure when you think about it as something that can be distilled. It's actually the thing that has to be distilled to get amaretto, which is a liqueur. So I'm already breaking my train of thought. But there are a couple bespoke spirits that I don't even know the name of, but I have heard of them before. They use almond as a base. The next weird one, I swear the A's are just a weird start, is artichoke. There are actually things distilled from artichoke. I've never tried one, so couldn't tell you if you actually get that herbal taste or not, or if it tastes like something else altogether. Okay, so the first slightly more serious one as it pertains to spirits is the key ingredient, one of the only major spirits I don't have sitting here, which is tequila, and that ingredient is agave. So specifically blue agave, we've talked about that before too, grows very well in the Jalisco state of Mexico, specifically in the town of Tequila. It's kind of spread out into some neighboring states as well, but it really only grows down there. Tequila can only be produced in Mexico, and all the good stuff is made with 100% blue agave. So it is very similar to aloe. It's a very close relative to aloe, and it looks very similar. So, but they get big, I mean like big, and there are workers called humidors that go around and they cut the agave with these big, they look like kind of like a flat shovel, and they shear all the external leaves off, and it's actually the core of the agave, really it has a formal name, but it's kind of the ball left over after they shear off the external leaves. Kind of if you think about peeling an artichoke, actually, what's left in the middle, those are what are ground up, fermented, and then distilled, and then you end up with tequila. Now, the first grain we're going to be talking about is barley. Now, barley goes in a lot, frankly, just period. Pretty much all of your big grains go in a lot of different things. Like I've got a vodka that's not sitting here, good planning, that is like 100% rye based. So rye being like the grain. Wheat is super common, blah, 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 blah. These grains show up in a lot of things, but barley is bespoke in that it is the sole ingredient of single malt whiskey. So single malt whiskey being single malt scotch. So whiskey with just a Y, no EY. Now, it's critical just because that's the ingredient. That's the only thing it's made of. Now, specifically, it's not just barley. Barley has to be malted first. I'm going to talk about malting in like a couple minutes, so I'll circle back to that, but malted barley is the only thing that can be used in single malt scotch, hence the single malt, single grain, single malted grain. Okay, so next grain up is corn. So corn, I'm not going to belabor too much just because it's another grain, it goes in most anything, but it is a critical component in bourbon. So I've mentioned it multiple times in multiple videos now that bourbon has to be 51% corn by its mash bill. Some are much heavier, like Maker's Mark. It goes all the way up to 80% corn, and the rest is other grains. So something like Ezra Brooks, I actually don't know what percentage of corn it is, but it is a bourbon, therefore it's mostly corn that's sitting in this bottle. So that's corn in a nutshell, in a kernel. All right, so now grapes. Going down the list, that is our next ingredient. Now, grapes are kind of a misnomer because really it's wine, but it depends on the spirit where you pick up the grape in the process as to whether you'd recognize it as a grape, as whether you'd recognize it as wine, or just funky grape juice. So things like pisco and brandy are both come down that same tree of distilling fermented grape juice. Now, if you want to call that wine or not, that's up to you. I would personally call it wine, definitely in the case of traditional brandy. Pisco, they ferment a little differently using like open vats. The grapes are pressed a different way, so they can be produced using open vats. And the grapes are pressed a little differently, so I would argue that is more like just a fermented grape juice. It's not a wine that you would drink necessarily. Now, something like grappa, which I've also talked about before, which uses a grape pomace, it really does come from grapes, I feel is fair to say. So your high-end grappas come exclusively from grape skins. Your very low-end grappas use everything, so grape skin, grape seed, grape stem, whatever, they're throwing it in there. When they include the stems, it gives it a bit of a bitter note. So really with grappa, the more you pay, if you're not just paying for the name, you're paying for the ingredient. So there's yeast that naturally grows on the grape skin. Now a lot of that comes off while it is being pressed into wine. So grappa is very much a side product. They press the grapes, they take all the juice off to make wine, and then all the bleh gets pushed to the side for grappa. Doesn't mean grappa's any worse, it's all the gook. So there's some yeast there. Sometimes they have to reintroduce some because the rest has been sloughed off into what will become the wine. Okay, so next up are juniper berries. Now, juniper berries specifically go into gin, and they're most prominent in your London dry gins. Your standard gin versus Old Tom is often less juniper heavy. So juniper berries are added in that second distillation that I've talked about with gin. So when I actually talk about distilling here in a bit, I'll bring that back up. But juniper berries are critical to gin, and that's really the only place you see them in mass. Okay, so now as promised, and working our way down the alphabetical order, we're at malted grains. So as I mentioned before, malted barley is absolutely critical to single malt scotch, and really most scotches, period. So what is malting? Malting is a way that grains are prepared before they are fermented. So what they do, they take the grain, let's say it's barley, and they soak it. They soak it for a couple of days. They sit in these big vats. You may have seen photos of this and might not have realized it because malting is fairly popular in beer too. They use it in a lot of their commercials. You see these big vats of stuff floating or churning. So you float the barley, and what that does is that water psychs out that seed, the grain, into thinking it needs to germinate. So you start to, over time, and it's not a very long time, but you start to get the little tendril of a baby plant that starts to poke out. That's kind of the end physical, at least optical, sign of a malted grain. So they take the seed out of the water, or the grain out of the water, and they go ahead and spread it on these big aerated floors. So that gives the seed the opportunity to finish germinating with the little tendril poking out, and you have somebody who goes through and turns them every day. It has to be aerated to keep anything from like growing in there, to keep it from rotting. You also, as it starts to sit there, it's going to start to ferment, so it's going to heat differently. So they have to make sure they turn it and turn it and turn it. Then from there, they go ahead and heat it to dry it, and then once it's dry, it can be fermented. Now, or properly fermented, I should say. Now, why do they have to do all of this? Well, for one, the grains can be pretty hard at the beginning. So if they need to crush them for any reason, that can be challenging. So the soaking and then drying helps with that. It makes them more brittle. Most importantly though, once that grain germinates, something biologically happens in there that allows the sugars in the grain to separate to become independent, And then once you introduce yeast to that, now that yeast can get to the sugar and it has something to eat. And thus fermentation kicks off in full. Okay, so next up is molasses. So molasses, you would know, is that thick, gooey brown sugar sort of stuff. It's like the ingredient for rum. So I've talked about this before too, as to why rum is so high in sugar content, because it's distilled from sugar cane. And at that, the sugar cane is processed down into molasses, which isolates more of the sugars, really concentrates them, and then that they let the yeast just go crazy on. Doesn't take long for that stuff to just go up, and then they go ahead and distill it, and out comes white or dark rum. Really, it all comes out white, but white or dark rum. Okay, another grain that I'm just gonna kind of gloss over is oats. Oats go in quite a few things. They don't really have a specific drink that they're associated with, but it's one of those filler grains that could be present in just about anything short of like your specifics like tequila. Next on the list is potatoes, our potatoes. So I've talked about a lot of these things before, so as many times as I referenced in the spirits video that I need to make this video, I'm now asking you to go back and watch. I need original content. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, I've talked about before that potatoes are a traditional mash something of vodka. So a lot of vodka was originally distilled for potatoes, especially Russian vodka. You can still find vodka that's distilled from potatoes, but it's not nearly as pervasive anymore. That's largely the place that you see potato distillation. It doesn't show up in a whole lot of other spirits. They might be out there. That's up to you to go and find those. Okay, two more grains that I'm gonna kind of walk right over. Rye and rice. Now, rye is absolutely critical for rye whiskey. Rye whiskey needs a 51% rye mash bill, so it has to include 51% rye. It's the dark grain like you think of rye bread. So this is not a rye whiskey. I don't have one sitting here. They have that little bit of a spice note. That's the difference between that really sweet corn and a little less sweet rye. Rice is another one that's not all that specific to a whole lot of spirits. There are some Japanese and Chinese spirits that use rice as a base, potentially Korean too. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's more associated with like a rice wine, so they typically just ferment the rice. But rice can be used as any sort of filler. If it's 51% corn in your bourbon, you have no idea. 49% of it might be rice for all you know. Another one is soybeans. So soybeans, that's another where it doesn't necessarily show up on a whole lot of bottles. Like, you're not gonna find like a soybean rum, and you're probably gonna be hard pressed to find any sort of whiskey that claims to be soy, but it is another one of those filler. It's not a grain, but it functions a lot like the grains, where it's kind of this filler that just exists. Cool, so now we've got sugar beets and sugar cane. Now, sugar cane is quintessential for rum. Now, granted, it has to be broken down into molasses first, but rum agricole and I've talked about before, cachaça are both sugarcane based. Now, cachaça uses fermented sugarcane juice, whereas rum uses fermented molasses or sorghum. So that's the big difference there, is that it's coming directly from the sugarcane. Sugar beets, I would assume, can work in a fairly similar way, considering they're used largely, cane and beets are used largely interchangeably in any sort of table sugar, or baking sugar. Both those might not be a thing. They're used pretty interchangeably in the production of sugar, so they might work fairly similar there. Or another thing you could add to a mash bill that would give the yeast a little more to munch on. All right, last two ingredients that I can think of. We've got wheat, another grain. It just happens. It'll show up in your whiskeys, it'll show up in your vodkas, it could even show up in your gin. Wheat's more special when it comes to the world of beer, so I'm not going to belabor it too much here. And finally, wine. Now, I've already pretty much talked about wine's role in distillation of brandy and pisco and pretty much any other type of pseudo brandy. Okay, so we've talked about all the ingredients, but there's also a couple specific and special ways these ingredients can be prepared before they are turned into a spirit. So the first has to do with malting, and it's called peat malting. So peat malting is specific to types of scotch that are referred to as peaty. So peat is harvested directly from the ground. It's similar to soil, it's similar to sod, but it's kind of like a precursor to coal. So you find it in these peat bogs, which Scotland has a lot of, hence why peat is most heavily used in Scotch. Now, peat's been burned as a fuel source in Scotland for a very long time, because once it is dried into briquettes, it is flammable and it will burn for a long time. So as to whether this was done intentionally in the beginning as let's make our whiskey peaty, or whether it was just the fuel source at hand, I'm not sure. I'm thinking it was probably a little more out of necessity. But anyway, the way this is done, peat could be used to heat the fire under the still. It could be used for anything, but it only imparts flavor if it's used to heat the malted barley. So as I was mentioning, while the malting process is going on with the barley, it has to be dried. So what they do is they heat it from below, and to create that heat, they burn peat, and that releases the peat smoke, which imparts the peat flavor into the barley. And then once that barley is put in the still, that flavor carries through. So whiskeys like Lefroy, which I had mentioned in the previous installment, is a historically and well-known peaty whiskey. And it's a very unique flavor. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but it is one of those special preparations that's kind of a fun fact to know, especially if you're talking to any sort of whiskey buff. It's a neat fact to be able to talk to them about. Okay, and the last little preparation bit has to do with excessive or special fermenting. So I've already talked about grappa, brandy, and pisco all have to have grapes fermented in slightly different ways. So I've kind of talked about those in full already, so I won't dive back into those. I also mentioned that cachaça uses fermented sugarcane. So that is different in that rum uses fermented molasses, whereas cachaça goes ahead and ferments the sugarcane juice first and then goes ahead and distills that juice. So I guess there'd be some sort of like sugarcane wine would be the closest thing to that is once it's going into the still. The last kind of specific / outright weird one is Jamaican rum. So I've mentioned before that Jamaican rum has a funk, which is the way of describing its smell. Now that smell is really, you're picking up some unique notes of like fruit. So people said it might smell like an overripe banana or kind of like overripe fruit. So that's that funk that's coming through. And believe it or not, that smell is actually kind of accurate to what's going on, and it's a little funky, so hold on tight. So there's a couple of specific processes that Jamaican rum goes through. The first is that they add what is called dunder, as in like Dunder Mifflin, if you're thinking of The Office. They add this dunder, which is some of the leftover mash from the previous distillation. And what they do this for is it imparts a unique flavor, but also those yeast molecules or organisms are already munching to their heart's content in there. So when they add the dunder, the leftover from the previous, it just kind of kickstarts the reaction in the new batch. This is also done in sour mash whiskey. The sour mash is a little bit of the leftover from the previous that they just keep passing down, and it just kickstarts it. There's nothing actually sour about it. It's just referring to the old mash. But anyway, back to Jamaican rum. They add this dunder back in, so that's one thing that they change about the mash bill. The other thing is they add what is called, and I kid you not, muck, M-U-C-K. And this muck is pretty true to what you'd think about. They take the dunder that is left over, or just the expended mash. They combine it with little rotting fruit, and then they throw it in outdoor vats with no cover, nothing, and they just let it sit there and ferment. They'll throw in sugarcane, they'll throw in molasses, which would be part of the mash bill anyway, but there's some fresh molasses in there to ferment, and just leave it out there in the sun or whatever and let it do its thing. When they add that, the muck into the mash bill, that's what really gives it the funk. And once you distill it, you weed out all the funky organisms and stuff that be growing in there, any of the nasty bitter notes that might be in there. But what's happened in that muck pit is all these fruits and stuff have really decomposed and created just these long chains of sugars and stuff. So once those are distilled out, they actually taste pretty good, as weird as the practice might sound. And it gives it that distinct, not quite rotten note, but a little bit of like an overripe, like, ooh, these bananas need to get thrown out probably tomorrow, or like we're eating them today sort of thing. So that's what makes Jamaican rum special. Okay, so next we're gonna jump into the actual distilling process. So I'm gonna switch you over to my computer screen so I can kind of walk you through these diagrams of how the two common types of distillation work. So the first is going to be a pot still, which I will pop up a little image of what I'm gonna be showing you here in a second of what it looks like. So pot stilling is the oldest, pot still distilling is the older form of distillation, and that was followed much later by column stills, and column stills are what are largely used in mass manufacturing now. So I will switch around the screens. So we're going to take a step-by-step look at how these two processes work, and I'm going to go ahead and switch you over to the computer screen. Okay, so the oldest type of distillation or method of distillation is what's referred to as pot still distilling. So this dates back hundreds of years. This is how a lot of your classic spirits really came onto the scene. I've mentioned in another video there was an older technique that relied on the freezing of an alcoholic or fermented substance to concentrate the alcohol content. That's really the only other precursor before we get into some form of pot still distillation. So what you see in front of you is a classic example of a traditional pot still. So these are what have been used for a couple hundred years, but they're also what are still used in a number of distilleries. So a pot still is actually a really simple thing. So I'm going to point out a couple of key facets of the design of the pot still before getting into the exact process. So you'll notice at the bottom here there is one large sort of elliptical shape. Now granted, this is simply a diagram, but they do look fairly similar to this. So at the bottom we have the copper pot, which is this large elliptical shape down here. I colored it all brown or kind of rust because that's the closest I can get to copper. The entirety of what you see in brown would be copper in the full apparatus. Now pot stills can be fairly small, they can also be huge. So these things could be multiple stories high. They could also be enough to fit in a garage, if that's even legal. But in any case, they vary in size, but the function works about the same way. So in the base, that copper pot, that holds the actual mash. So that's what you're going to be distilling. Now up above that you have the OG, or what's sometimes referred to as the onion. And it looks just very extra, like why would that need to be there? It does serve a specific purpose, and I'll get into that as we step through. But just to know that name up there, and that it's not simply for looks, that has a real purpose. Now that's connected to sort of funnel or concentrator that carries into the swan neck, which is then connected to the line arm. These are very fancy terms to say it's effectively a pipe that starts to run it towards the coolant tank, in which it's going to be condensed, but we'll get into that in a second. I also have labeled without a proper arrow the spirit safe, which is represented by that graduated cylinder there. That is where the distillate, which is the proper term, should correct that in the previous part of the video, that is where the distillate or what has been distilled is going to be collected. So those are the major components that I just want to point out off the get-go. Now, the first step is to go ahead and load the mash in there. Now, like we said, the mash could be a concentration of any number of things. So let's say they are distilling bourbon, that's going to be 51% corn at least, and the rest is going to be who knows what. That is already fermented. The extent of that varies as well, but there is yeast in there attacking the sugars and the grains or whatever is being fermented, and now it's time to distill those alcohols out. So how do we do that, or how do they do that? They heat the mash. Now what that does is alcohol boils before water. Likewise, what you would call like the flavor molecules, just molecules of the mash that impart the flavor, they also volatilize before water, meaning that those molecules eject out into the air. So once that alcohol starts to vaporize, it carries the vapors of the flavor components as well. So that's how you end up getting flavors out of the mash, whereas if you purify this far enough, you're really just going to end up with pure alcohol. But so long as you don't do that, you do carry these flavor components with you into the later stages and all the way through to consumption in most cases. So now you've got these alcohol vapors boiling out, they're carrying with them the flavor components as well. They are going upwards because heat rises, the steam and alcohol vapor is going upwards into the OG. Now what happens here, as I mentioned, it has a real purpose. Along that exterior wall, which is cooler just due to the heating and distance from the heat source, as it's cooling down, it collects on the interior there and some of the alcohol drips back down. Now what this does is it helps to purify. Now I said previously that if you want flavor, you don't want to purify the whole thing. But there are heavier components that you don't want to transfer in. I mean, heavy metals would be the absolute sort of example of such, but there's just other compounds that you don't want in such high concentrations. You might not even want that much flavor. It's one of those things where there's some cases where a little bit of something tastes good, too much of something tastes bad, and you want to eliminate those less savory, less safe compounds as well. So it collects in the OG or the onion, drips back down, and that's how it is effectively redistilled. And that happens however many times, just naturally. There's no formal number, it happens on a continuous basis. But eventually, some of these alcohol molecules and flavor molecules make it right up into the swan neck. So those vapors have escaped. They are now on a track to your bottle, or probably more appropriately, your barrel. So once it's flown down the swan neck and the line arm, like I said, that's really just a pipe that gets into a condenser. Now you get to the coolant tank and the vapor condenser and the condenser coil. So there's three components that all play into this system here. So the coolant tank is typically water filled. You can think of that as a big cylinder. It could be an actual tank that's just filled and this condenser runs through it. Pictured here, it doesn't necessarily come down to a point quite like that. The condenser coil is probably more of like a spring all the way down. But what happens in here is the cool water cools the sidewalls of the condenser coil, which in turn starts to condense, just like condensation, the alcohol vapors along with the flavor compounds, so that once it hits the bottom of that coil, it is now in liquid form versus vapor form. And from there, it can go ahead and drop into that spirit safe. Now, the spirit safe collects all those things, and unless you were drinking straight moonshine, this is not something you would otherwise be drinking per se. Almost everything is aged to an extent. Even your alcohols that I traditionally say aren't aged, often they still are in glass or stainless steel. It's just not a major part of their taste, or really it might even be for such a short period. It's unnoticeable, but typically there is a stage in between here and consumption, like I said, with the exception of something like moonshine. So the other thing it has to do, even before it manages to hit a barrel or bottle, it has to be inspected. So you have somebody inspecting both for taste, and then you have quality inspecting for safety. So this is still, it falls under food and drug rules sort of thing, or really alcohol, tobacco, and firearms probably. Somebody has oversight over this to make sure that your alcohol is safe for consumption if you're also safe about that consumption. Anywho, they're going to go ahead and check that. Somebody with an expert palate is going to see that maybe something's not right here, or they're going to recommend it for a certain type of aging, any number of things. The other thing of note is typically with this process, you have heavy metals and other compounds that are undesirable that come through at the very beginning and at the very end. So you want to hit that sweet spot in the middle. So that's what they're testing for and tasting for. So a decent amount, not a ton, but a decent amount on either end do get thrown out. It's not necessarily wasteful because they will taste poor and they might be moderately toxic. So I'd just roll with it and be okay with taking that middle section. Also of note that is important here is I mentioned the idea of sour mash in bourbon or they also refer to it as dunder, most specifically when we're talking about Jamaican rum. So what they do is they take a little bit of that mash once this distillation is taken care of. They save some of it. It still has the yeast just going crazy on those sugars. They dump that into the next pot and the whole process takes over. If they're not doing a sour mash or employing dunder, then otherwise this whole pot's going to be cleaned out and they're going to put a new one in. So a critical part of pot still distilling is that it's a batch-based process. So no two batches can really be identical because they undergo slightly different processes. I mean, the fire could be a little different in heat. The mash could be ever so slightly different. It's just environmental procedures or when somebody cut the tap at either end of that sweet zone. So in higher end products, often you will see like single batch or small batch, something like that, where small batch typically inferring that they're doing it on such a small quantity that they really think they can keep quality in check. Such a small quantity, keep good quality. Otherwise, to say single batch really just means that they're not blending the product at the end. This is all from one distillation. So whether that tastes better or worse, that's really very subjective, really in both cases. But there are some very, very successful labels that operate under this. An example of a small batch would be something like Hendrick's Gin. They're very proud for that. And there's also plenty of single batch whiskeys and such. So it is prevalent. It's just something good to know. Okay, so the other method of distillation is what's called column still distillation. And this is much more complicated. So this diagram is going to look more confusing. I'm probably going to get more convoluted. There's more things happening at once. So I will do my best to explain how all this is happening simultaneously. You'll see what I mean in a second when I say it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, in the sense that things that are happening on one side of the process are required for the other side of the process, but they're happening at the same time. As I said, I will do my best. It's very cyclical. In any case, column still distillation is unique because it produces continuous distillation. So this was invented much more recently than pot still distillation. And the big advantage with it is that it can just continuously crank out. As long as you're putting input into one end, you're getting output out the other end. So this really allowed distilleries to ramp up production. It also lends itself very well to vodka. As we'll discuss, it just by the process itself, it really enables vodka producers to filter the heck out of their vodkas, which we've talked about in the spirits video, that a lot of vodkas are really chasing that. It's almost a pure alcohol sort of idea, but it's a toned down version. It's not just straight moonshine or anything. So column still distillation really revolutionized the entire industry. However, there are plenty of people who still swear by pot still distillation. The majority of your scotches are still going to be made using pot stills. Any small batch, any single batch, anything like that, or even just small distilleries, craft distilleries, whereas you're probably going to see these column stills in like mass production or much smaller versions of column stills in those smaller production settings. Okay, but going through a couple of key points here, and I'm going to try and use my mouse a little more here to guide the eye. Don't worry, I still have plenty of bright colors, almost too many. So a couple things before we dig into this. This still fundamentally works very similar to the pot still method. At the end of the day, you are heating up your mash. That's already fermenting. You are isolating those alcohol and flavor vapors, and you are trying to collect those. So you use a heat source to do that. It involves just geometry and physics to push things up to the top, blah, 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 and it's all going to get condensed back at the end. So some of these words will look fairly similar. So, we have a heat source down at the bottom of the first still. We have a condenser chamber now, but a condenser coil and condenser chamber on the other end that is going to eventually go ahead and collect all of the spirit. And instead of a spirit safe, now we're going to have a spirit collector. So those are a couple of the things that it does share in similarity with the pot still. Now that's kind of where it ends. You have 2 stills traditionally, or 2 columns in this distillation method traditionally. You can have more, you can have less, but typically it's 2 or more. So the first still is referred to as the analyzer still, and that is this portion here. It looks like a silo. And the second still is what's referred to as the rectifier, that is here. So some of the other things that are notable, instead of all of the mash being in one place per se, like it was in the pot still where it's just all dumped into the copper pot, now we have a feedstock supply, and they're calling it feedstock instead of a mash. It is the mash that's being piped through. So just a couple other things to point out about my diagram specifically. The light blue represents the spirit, the yellow represents the mash, but also these blue lines that you see represent a cold liquid. The red lines represent a hot liquid, and then we're going to have just this chamber is hot altogether. Likewise, the heat source is hot. I managed to keep it contiguous. Okay, so moving forward though, our first steps here, water is going to be injected into or just above the heat source. What that's going to do is that's going to immediately vaporize the water, and it's going to turn it into steam. At the same time, or simultaneously, you have cold feedstock that is going to the condenser. Now, one other thing I want to point out here are all of these lines and tubes that you see here. So the vertical lines are plates, and these plates act as roadblocks to the vaporized spirits and water. And I'll get back into this, but I want to explain what these are. The vertical rectangles you see are to represent tubes. So like I said, per geometry and physics, as we go up farther away from the heat source, now and heat rises, granted, but as we go farther away from the heat source, these plates are consecutively cooler. So what ends up happening is you get condensation on each plate. Now what these tubes allow to happen is they allow that condensate to drip back down, and then small holes in the plates themselves as well as the tubes allow vapor to go up. So what that does is each time it goes up a new plate, more and more condenses and comes back down, and only the lightest of the vapors makes it out the top. So typically that is your pure alcohol with maybe a bit of water, and then your most refined of your flavor vapors. So as I mentioned with vodka, this is very helpful because if you put enough plates in there, you really can achieve it something like 96% alcohol. So if you really, really want to distill this all the way down, you can basically get that to pure rubbing alcohol. So fewer plates mean you're carrying through a little bit more water, but also typically more flavor. Getting back on track, the water input is going in and the cold feedstock is going to the condenser. What happens now, you have that vapor, or the water has been vaporized into steam. Now, the cold feedstock that went to the condenser was heated by the condenser because the condenser chamber is hot. And that hot feedstock now that it has gone through is cycling all the way around up here and is dropping into the very top of the analyzer still. So what happens here is that feedstock is allowed to flow through those tubes, and it starts to go down to the bottom, but as it's dripping down to the bottom, the steam catches it. So it heats it and isolates or liberates the alcohol and flavor molecules, and it also carries them upwards. So the steam's going up, hence the arrow, and the hot feedstock is coming down. So you have the two mixing, and one's carrying one up while the other is dripping down. The dripping down also carries some of that condensate, which helps it to just go cyclically around and just redistill, 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 redistill. The vapor and steam are going up to this tube up here. Now, that vapor and steam is now going to the rectifier. So basically the same thing is going to happen in this chamber, or rather in this column. However, the heat is being carried through from the previous still, as well as just the alcohol and vapor components, and some of the steam definitely still remains. That's what's really driving it, or that's the heat that's driving it. But now none of the mash per se is in this still. Now it's carrying components of the mash, but the rest of the mash or the feedstock is dripping down towards the heat source, and it's going to end up flowing out. Same thing happens again in this in this column. Vapor and steam are going upwards. These plates and tubes are helping to condense it, and then drips back down, and then it gets reheated, flows back up, drips back down, cyclically over and over and over again. So once again, the taller these columns are, or more specifically the number of plates they have, are define the purity or the filtration, however you want to refer to it, of the spirit. So these will be pretty tall stills just per the diagram. There are plenty that are much shorter or just much smaller in general. Maybe they have smaller plates altogether, can't condensate as much, or they could be much taller if it's something like a vodka production. So now flowing out of the top of the second still, the alcohol vapor as well as the flavor molecules are going to the condenser. The whole chicken and the egg thing here really kind of comes to a head in this situation. So I mentioned that chamber is hot. That's how you heat the feedstock in the first place before you drop it into the very hot still. The thing that heats the condenser is the hot vapor. Or the thing that heats the condenser chamber is the hot vapor, and then it flows through its own condenser coil, as it's doing it, transfers its own heat, and by the time it's exiting the condenser chamber, the alcohol vapor is cooled and the feedstock supply has been warmed. So this is what I was saying. This is really where it comes to head, and that confusion kind of sets in. There's two things happening at once that both happen, or are both direct results of the process. One way or another, that feedstock's getting heated by the alcohol vapor. The alcohol vapor is being cooled by the feedstock, and by those two intermingling, you get what you want out of both ends. Anyways, you end up with liquid alcohol with their flavor components going into that spirit collector, which in the same way it was with the pot still, it's going to be tested for taste, and it's going to be tested for purity, it's going to be tested for safety. And then out of the bottom of the first still, you have used feedstock that is flowing out. Out of the bottom of the second still, you have the remaining water flowing out. This is all happening, but it all happens at once. It happens simultaneously. So used feedstock's flowing out constantly, water's flowing out constantly. You have spirit collecting constantly. At the same time, the beginning of the process is happening where you're pumping hot feedstock through, you're heating feedstock, you're pumping in water, that fire's just going the whole time. This is how they're able to produce so much spirit, so much distillate with this process. Welcome back to me. The next thing we're going to talk about is aging and finishing. So finishing is kind of a term that I've made up of sorts. Finishing is going to refer to what happens immediately to the spirit after it has left the still. So whether that's going into a barrel or whether it's being redistilled or what that's going to look like. But first we'll go ahead and we'll talk about aging. So aging is done for a number of reasons. For one, it helps the molecules in the spirit to react with one another. It often kind of tempers that really harsh alcoholic note if you go ahead and age it. A number of things are aged in stainless steel or glass, so they don't pick up the wood notes. However, a number of things, pretty much all of your dark liquors are aged in some sort of barrel, and often it's American or Hungarian oak. Now, this differs with the type of, or rather the age of barrel that they use, but in any case, in most circumstances, they're looking for it to impart color, like you see in this whiskey, and the taste. So you're looking for cinnamon, vanilla, maybe clove in some cases. Caramel is a really popular one that people pick up, and it also helps to mellow out the alcohol in there. So the process makes it smoother to drink by adding in some of those, but they're called tannins, or these molecules that physically make it taste a little more silky, and also some of the alcohol leaches out of the barrel. So the alcohol molecules are small enough that they can slip through the cracks of the barrel over time. So what this is called is, they call it the angel share. And what this is the amount or the volume that is put into the barrel that disappears by the time they open it up. And this varies greatly based on region. So like a bourbon being aged in Kentucky versus a rum being aged in Puerto Rico, these are very different climates. They age much quicker in humidity. So I've talked about before that like most dark rums are only aged like 2 months, whereas pretty much any whiskey on the shelf you're gonna find is aged at least 2 years. So it just changes wildly. Even like your really high-end tequilas, at most they're aged like 3 years, or at most, by minimum, they're aged like 3 years. They can be aged much longer, but just due to the climate in Mexico versus a Canadian whiskey or something, or Scotch is notorious for being aged for a really long time. Climate dictates this, and one way you can tell is based on the angel share, how quickly that alcohol evaporates from the barrel and leaving your spirit. Okay, so as promised, here I am in a different shirt and even different shorts and a different drink. So if you saw my previous video on the Chambord Manhattan, this is it. This is also proof that I'm actually drinking it. So when I left off, we were talking about barrel aging or just aging in general, what the benefits of aging are, what it does to the molecules at a high level, and also just what the wood imparts to the spirit. So why do we age in barrels? So that was the last thing we talked about. So now I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the specific aging processes that are associated with specific spirits. So first up is going to be rum. So rum, like I have sitting right here, is what is typically referred to as like a non-aged spirit, or at least white rum, like what is sitting here, is often thought of as non-aged. That's not totally fair. I've dropped this a couple of times now, that even things that are traditionally non-aged are often, or not thought of as aged, are actually aged. They just are put into a container like glass or stainless steel or even well-used barrels, so they don't pick up the color. So something like this Bacardi right here, it is actually aged for a full year, and then it's filtered through charcoal to eliminate some of the color and even some of the aspects of the barrel that it's aged in. I genuinely don't really know why they do that. I know it has to do with the smoothness that the barrel imparts and like just the breakdown of those alcohol molecules, but as to the full chemical process that happens when you charcoal filter it, I can only help you so much there. But so even something like a white rum is technically aged. It could come straight from the still. That probably wouldn't be all that delectable. It would probably be a little rough. So just keep that in mind. I think I've mentioned that a couple times now. It might sound like a broken record. Anywho, white rum is aged for a pretty short period of time. We've talked about climate a little bit, how the warmer climates where rum is typically produced, such as the Caribbean islands or Central America or even into South America. Mexico is not in South America, don't worry, I wasn't confused like that. So we've talked about how those warmer and humid climates adjust the time it takes to age something. So especially if they're aging in any sort of oak, like a traditional barrel, it's going to age much quicker. That angel sherry is going to come out quicker, so it just doesn't need to sit as long as something like your traditional whiskeys do. So dark rum, on the other hand, is traditionally an aged product that we know to, or that you think of as being aged. So it is placed in barrels. It's still not barrel aged all that long, for that same reason, that largely climate-driven reason. So I mentioned before how some of those rums, there's actually caramel color added to give the appearance that it has soaked up more of those barrel notes. It doesn't need to. That's just kind of a consumer thing, that you don't think it's been aged, or you don't think it's been aged as long if it does not represent that really kind of whiskey darkness that you associate, or even directly associate with a rum that is aged much longer, something like a Gosling's that I've mentioned in previous videos. So another is vodka, and I've actually got two sitting here now, so I added one from the last video. But vodka is another one that's thought of traditionally as a non-aged spirit. That's still not true per se. It's going to sit in some sort of cask or container, or maybe a barrel in some cases, but typically stainless steel or glass, just so it can sit and so it can evolve on its own a little bit. The other special thing, and why I'm calling this aging and finishing, is the fact that vodka is redistilled a number of times. So something like 10 times filtered is something that companies really like to throw on the label of their bottles. So I genuinely don't know how many times these have been filtered, but that's a special process that they go through towards the end of the distillation process. I've mentioned how the column stills work. That could mean that it's just running through a number, many number of plates in the column still distillation process that really lends itself to vodka, or it could be going through a pot still process and they just run it for a really long time, or they really do throw it back in to redistill instead of the mash. So there are a couple ways to do that. It's not aged as long, if it's aged at all, as some products, but it does go through that specific finishing process. So gin, similar to vodka, is virtually never aged. Now, you can find aged gins, like you can find pretty much everything now in some capacity if you know where to look. But similar to vodka and its excessive filtration, gin goes through a different type of finishing method where it is redistilled with its botanicals. So when it comes out of the still, gin can be very, very similar to vodka. But they put the distillate that came out of that distillation in with what is now what is distilled now in the second time, which is typically your juniper berries, your citrus, these things that give it its heavy flavor notes. That's the big differentiation between gin and vodka. That's what imparts its flavor, and it's not aged after that per se. It might go into some sort of holding container, but it's that finishing process that really gives it its unique characteristics. Okay, and whiskey has its own set of very specific aging principles. To just whip through a couple of them off the top of my head, if you're thinking of bourbon, bourbon has to be aged in American oak barrels, new charred American oak barrels. So it has to meet all these qualifications, and that's just the aging process, or that's just the barrel process. If it's something like a straight bourbon, then it means it needs to be aged for at least 2 years. If it's something like a bonded bourbon, that means it has to be aged for at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse. We've talked about bonded before too. There are some other rules that come along with it. If you want to look up that full list of rules and also the full bourbon rules, that is in the spirits video. So I won't dive back into those too much. Similarly, I talked fairly at length about the different rules that are associated with Scotch as to what constitutes a single malt, as to all these other things. So go ahead and check that out for if you have extenuating questions with that. But I will throw in there that Irish whiskey and Scotch, not that they are even similar, I'll keep those separate, but due to the climates that they are both distilled in, similarly with Canadian whiskey and really even American whiskey, they all can go through very lengthy aging processes, with Irish whiskey and Scotch really taking the crown there. So it's not unheard of to hear of a 20-year-old Scotch like fairly casually. It'll still cost you plenty, don't get me wrong, but like that's a fairly casual age, whereas if you go to a high-end liquor store, you can find old Scotches that run you a lot of money. I went to Total Wine the other day, and they, in one of their special cabinets, they have a it rounds up to like a $22,000 50-year-old whiskey. So aging does impart value and flavor and smoothness, but whiskey is unique in that category versus pretty much any other spirit. That aging really dominates a lot of the taste, the smoothness, and also the price. So brandy similarly goes through a number of aging processes, very specific aging processes. So this applies both to brandy and cognac and Armagnac. I might not have said that wrong. I might not even have spelled that wrong. I'll go ahead and put it down here. It's a relative to cognac, so also French. So these go by their acronym systems. Once again, in the spirits video, I talk about this in length, so I won't belabor them too much, but you have VS very special, VO very old, VSOP very special, old and pale, XO is extra old, and then you have Ordage, which is just your super high end off the charts, really old. It might be 40 years old and it might cost you 30 grand. So they have their own sort of aging system. The aging process and what it imparts to the spirit is very similar to whiskey, and it has once again to do with the climate that brandy and cognac and Armagnac are typically produced in, be it France, be it Northern California, anywhere in between Italy within reason, or even just mountainous regions. You end up with low humidity and low year-round temperatures. Means things need to be aged longer to get that effect. So 3 more to talk about aging, and I'm also gonna toss in a disclaimer right now. I'm not gonna be talking about the aging of grappa. Frankly, it's just something I'm not familiar enough with to even pretend to pass along that information. So if you care to dig into that, feel free. That can be your homework to take home from this. But tequila being the biggest of the 3, at least in the US, tequila, you have your 3 different strains, types. You've got your white or blanco or silver, all synonyms or just correct Spanish. You also have gold reposado, or you have añejo. So your white, silver, blanco is going to be aged for a minimum period. So it's typically not aged in oak. That's probably where it would end up in something like a glass container or stainless steel, just to tone down some of those notes, and then it's going into a bottle. Whereas reposado, you're looking at more like a year to 2 years, and that picks up that golden color. The milder notes picks up the tannins from the used bourbon barrels typically, and it gives it color, flavor, kind of texture and body. And then you have añejo, which has to be aged for at least 3 years. Now, I am just really driving this home. Those 3 years can count for a lot more. That doesn't sound like much, like a straight whiskey, which admittedly it's a good but a cheap whiskey. That's 2 years versus 3 years for your high-end top shelf tequila. It just happens so much quicker down in that region of Mexico. So it's on a different scale altogether. And finally, we have the 2 South American spirits that I've been talking about in some of the videos. We have cachaça, which is the Brazilian national spirit. The light varieties, just like rum, just like tequila, aren't aged in oak or any sort of barrel. It's going to be aged in stainless steel or glass. Doesn't change the flavor all that much. That's your cheaper stuff. Once you move up into your colored or your dark cachaça, that's been aged in oak or a similar wood barrel, and that's going to impart those flavors. And finally, there's pisco. Pisco is most commonly found in the clear variety, where it's been aged in glass or aluminum or stainless steel. So once again, it doesn't pick up those tannins, those wood notes. However, you can find some varieties of pisco that have been aged in some sort of barrel. They're a little darker in color, like there's a slight yellow hue, and you're gonna get a subtle, mellow difference in that, or those classic kind of bourbon notes, the cinnamon, vanilla, caramel, and that's what you get. So that's kind of just a quick run through. I know a lot of that was really repetitive, but just kind of to drive home some of those facts. That's what some of those aging processes look like for those specific spirits. One of the last things that's going to happen to a spirit before it is put into the bottle is either blending or flavoring. And they can be thought of on kind of similar terms, because while the processes are very different, they both do something to either correct or add to the flavor. So something like a blended whiskey, it could be done to even out the flavor of a whiskey, because just because you have barrels sitting next to each other don't mean they taste the same. Just because you have whiskey distilled from the same corn in 2 different distilleries doesn't mean it's going to taste the same. So if you're chasing like a very distinct flavor, or you're trying to match a classic flavor, so something like Crown Royal, which has a storied past of whom it's been served to and this and that, they try very hard to maintain that classic taste, and they do it without flavoring. Instead, they do it with blending. So they go ahead and they sample barrels from all over their distillation network, and they combine those in specific amounts to be able to replicate that flavor based on what the barrels they have to work with. And next that you have flavoring. So flavoring would go in something like your coconut rums, your flavored vodkas, any number of things. And these can be done in different ways. They can be done kind of like gin, where it's redistilled with, instead of botanicals, it could be redistilled with coconut. Frankly, that's just a much harder way to do it. A lot of these are done with simple additives. Like a banana rum is probably hard pressed to actually be distilled with bananas, whereas it's all the more likely they have some sort of banana extract or banana flavor extract that they are then introducing into the spirit, blending it through before bottling. So that's how you get a lot of those flavored spirits, like your blue raspberry Smirnoff or Svedka. I don't even think there are blue raspberries if they're not like seriously genetically engineered, and they're sure as heck not distilling those. So wherever that flavor, that kind of Jolly Rancher flavor comes from, I don't know, they've got to be adding some sort of citric acid or something, but know that that's not a product of distillation so much as it's a product of flavor enhancement using syrups or acids or something like that. And finally, we will talk briefly about bottling. So bottling doesn't necessarily impact the flavor of a spirit. Technically, you could probably say the bottling has nothing to do with the spirit altogether, because if you pour this Bacardi out of this bottle, or if you pour Bacardi out of a smaller bottle or a plastic bottle, blind taste tests, you might never tell the difference. And you say what you will about glass versus plastic as to how that ages, if things leach into the liquid. That's a discussion that I'm not even going to get into right now, but I'm going to say for now that it's probably a small enough difference that you're not going to notice it. Bottling has less to do with flavor and more about imparted value, or perceived value, I guess is definitely the correct term. This really has nothing to do with the spirit that's inside, but I thought it's worth mentioning because it kind of goes along with how you shop spirits. So traditionally your bottom shelf spirits are often bottled in plastic, and your top shelf is almost exclusively glass. So, I mean, the vast majority are glass anyway. Bottom shelf does not have to be bad. Just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's bad. I've shown before Parrot Bay rum. That's usually in a plastic bottle, and that's pretty excellent coconut rum. So you don't need to bash it like that. Most of the smaller DeKuyper products, so I don't have one sitting up here because they pretty much exclusively do liqueurs or schnapps. A lot of their smaller sizes are all done in plastic. It looks cheaper, it feels cheaper, but if you can get past that, then the liquor on the inside is probably the same, or the liqueur on the inside is probably the same. Don't let it be the make or break for reaching out to try a different spirit. But if you do just want a cool bottle to set on your shelf, by all means go for it. I mean, if it looks pretty and shiny, I mean, you can still go out and buy it. Like, no one's gonna be mad at you. All right, so that has been the How Spirits Are Made special, the follow-up on my All About Spirits video that I previously posted. I hope that the two videos together can kind of supplement one another, and that you can reference them back and forth, because I know there were things in this video that I just simply referenced. You go to the last one because I don't want to make you sit here longer than I feel like you need to. So I really tried to convey all the information I could. Like I said, this is what I know. This is not coming from an expert per se. I am just passionate, and I am, like you, just doing this at home. So take what you've learned here. Nothing about what I said today has really anything to do with the quality of cocktails that you can make. Simply, it helps you understand where these things come from. And I think having a better understanding of our ingredients, both in cocktails, in food and drink in all regards, it really gives you a more holistic picture of, frankly, what you're consuming, but also gives you an appreciation of what goes into all these. I think every single spirit, frankly, beer, wine, liqueur, whatever, any alcoholic beverage, there's a ton of work that goes into it, and often a ton of time, be it a full growing season, be it the production of these stills or barrels, or just the time it takes to age some of these. So there's just a lot that goes into it, and when you do see an expensive bottle of something that's good, do your research on that, just to be able to appreciate it. I'm not saying you have to buy it, but just to be able to appreciate why things can be expensive, why things are reviewed as being good, and why certain things are called for. So foundational stuff, I hope it's helpful. With that, I'm Vic Vinegar. This is the Home Bar Beginner. I hope I've actually taught you something or in some way helped you. You got all the way to the end, so I applaud you for that. With no further ado, I hope that you can subscribe to the channel, maybe check the little bell thing if you want to be updated when new videos come out. Go ahead and give the video a like, comment questions you don't have, and other than that, just hit me up if you would like to know anything about the world of cocktails, or if you have recommendations for what you'd like to see me do in the future, both as a topic or just advice. Things are distilled from, well, not grappa, sorry,